Okay, to continue our business for today, I just would like to take this opportunity to start briefly discussing the apodictic qualification of ESL, EFL teachers or English language teachers to teach English language with theoretical and pragmatic principles and with communicative or communicative end in mind, in juxtaposition to the principles of contextualization, globalization, indigenization, localization, through the sound sense perspective of cultural, bicultural, multicultural methods, approaches, and techniques in addressing all the language learners' needs to develop and enhance their language proficiency in general. This YouTube online course is an English language teaching course for teachers of English as a second or foreign language, ESL, EFL teachers, or even to a generic term, English language teachers, as pointed up by Marian Sells Murcia, Diane Larson Freeman, with John Fredison, Benjamin White, and Howard Williams, 2016. In order to put this ESL, EFL course into perspective, let us briefly review the skills or competences you are ideally expected to have as a well-trained teacher of English to speakers of other languages. In short, qualifications to teach the English language to speakers or learners of other languages like ESL learners and ESL teachers at the same time. In order to teach the language, the target language, the second language, L2, English first of all, you are expected to have a good grasp of language teaching methodology, to know enough about available approaches and the nature of the learning process so that you can decide how to teach some particular aspect of the English language or a particular skill to a given group of students or language learners. Second, you should be familiar with available materials in order to select the most appropriate textbook for a class, or if possibly desirable and pedagogically necessary, be able to prepare your own original materials which are accurately and meaningfully appropriate to your students' needs vis-a-vis the developing or enhancing their language proficiency in a broadly general term. In some cases, you may have to adopt and adapt mandated existing materials that have somehow do not meet the needs of your students. You must be able to judge both the accuracy and the appropriateness of materials and to change and supplement as far as possible. Supplement them as apodictically needed beyond questions. A third requirement is that it is highly suggested that you provide a good linguistic model. You should ideally be a native or near native speaker of English. In the past, this requirement has sometimes been elevated to such a degree that it has been felt that this is the only qualification you need to teach English language to speakers of other languages. However, anyone who has attempted to teach English to speakers of other languages immediately realizes that being a native or near native speaker is not a sufficient qualification for being a language instructor. See? Then if you are a non-native or non-native, in other words, not native speaker of English, you really should, must, and even can provide an excellent role model for your students by demonstrating good and fluent control of the English language. This brings us to a fourth requirement. As a teacher of English as a second or foreign language, you must know your subject matter. You must have your conscious knowledge of the rules of the English language, the sound system or the phonological system, the grammatical system or the linguistic aspect, the lexical system, the vocabulary, words or lexicons, and the discourse structure. In other words, a teacher must be accurate, linguistically and grammatically accurate, updated. It is the grammatical system of the English language. That is to say, those aspects of English grammar most frequently taught in the EFL classroom, which we will be emphasizing in this online course, and the recent trends in language teaching. Consider one major course in the graduate program in applied linguistics. To quote Marian Sells Mercia and the young Larsen Freeman's Word and Thought, 1999. According to them, in the teaching of English, indeed, even a communicative approach involves a recognition of its grammar's central mediating role in the use and learning of language. As with the Sun 1998, Mercia and Freeman 1999, and 2016. actually have pointed out, emphasized, argued, and cited that using language grammatically, you have to take note of this, they said, using language grammatically and being able to communicate are not the same, but they are both important goals. Thus, the language teaching field would be well served by finding a way to help all students, language learners, accomplish both. That is, accuracy and fluency and the principles of learning and acquisition, or the pedagogical combinations of them all, are pedagogically conceived necessary. Now to continue my online YouTube lecture on English language teaching for English language teachers by yours truly, Professor Jose M. Dachugan. Once we engage in language teaching, it is necessary that we examine the theory of language vis-a-vis the English language teaching. Jack C. Richards and Theodore S. Rogers, my favorite applied linguists, 2014, have recently written a book on approaches and methods in language teaching, 2014, third edition. In this book, Richards and Rogers have pointed out that language is a very complex phenomenon and is studied from the perspective of many different disciplines, including linguistics, literature, psychology, anthropology, and sociology. The nature of language is that, like liquid, mutable, capable of frequent change. That is why there is nothing permanent about approaches, about methods, and always the pedagogical skills to be developed or enhanced by language teachers should also be updated in that sense. So the language teaching is a dynamic phenomenon that is affected by the way people speak and use it in different contexts. Nick Cipollone, Stephen Hartman, Kizar Sravan-Vazis, applied linguists, 1998, cited that language fills every part of our lives. It gives words to our thoughts, voice to our ideas, and expression to our feelings. It is a rich and varied human ability one can use without even a thought that children seem to acquire automatically and that linguists have discovered to be complex, yet describable. This will be the object of our course. The nature of language, which is primarily used for communication in both oral and written types of discourse, can lead teachers how to teach English with the communicative end in mind. Not surprisingly, a number of different theoretical views of language and the nature of language proficiency explicitly or implicitly inform current as well as recent approaches and methods in language teaching. Here, Jack C. Richards and Theodore S. Rogers, 2014, have briefly reviewed models of language that have influenced and that will somehow influence your cognition, your way of thinking, your way of belief in practices in the actual ESL classroom discourse. So we have to examine the following models of language teaching proposed by Jack C. Richards and Theodore S. Rogers, the two language teaching specialists whom I admire so much and emulate so much. According to Richard and Theodore, there are several methods, there are several models of language teaching. What are these models? Okay, first, we have cognitive model of language teaching and learning. Then two, we have structural model of language teaching. Three, we have functional model of language teaching. Four, we have interactional model. Then we have sociocultural model. Then we have genre model. And we have the lexical model. So we have to discuss the cognitive model of language teaching. A cognitive view of language is based on the idea that language reflects properties of the mind. That is the principle of cognitivism. Cognitivism, something to do with the mind. Cognitivism believes that all human beings are themselves naturally intellectual human creatures. Mind as a computer, or the human mind is like a computer. That is the belief of cognitivism. Mind as a computer is a set of operations that take in input, process it, and produce output as with a computer. So no matter what happens, as you notice, all human beings, unless they are abnormal, are able to acquire and speak the language. And this view of language teaching, it is believed that every language learner's mind is like a computer that is capable to store, acquire information, to take in input, capable of learning from what is received by the mind. has the capacity to produce or performs what he knows, what one knows. And then, that is the first characteristic of the cognitive model of language learning, or the view of cognitivism. Then another characteristic of cognitivism is that it is representationalism. The representationalism processes that the mind engages in to store internal representation of external events. That is why experiences are also very crucial for the learners to learn. That the language learner's mind has the capability to understand, infer, evaluate things that they see, feel, read, and study. Learning in here as abstract knowledge acquisition, that is, abstracting the rules of the competence that underlies linguistic performance, as Noam Chomsky puts it that way. Noam Chomsky is a great mind in the field of language. That is, according to Chomsky, 1957-1965, according to him, language learners have the capacity to perform what they know. That is competence. In the cognitive model of language teaching, we cannot ignore acknowledging the great Noam Chomsky, 1957 and 1965, the giant authority in his syntactic structure, 1957, and this aspect of the theory of syntax, 1965, that in all language teaching approaches and methods, applied linguists do acknowledge Noam Chomsky's distinction of competence and performance. It is where our applied linguists develop different principles of CC, communicative competence parameters, derived from Noam Chomsky, two major terms: competence and performance. As we have mentioned about Noam Chomsky, of his competence and performance, let me briefly explain or discuss these two major terms used by Noam Chomsky, 1965. Okay. Noam Chomsky's distinction of competence and performance, in which the parameters of communicative competence (CC) were created and developed. According to Chomsky, 1965, competence refers to the speaker-hearer's knowledge of his language. Knowledge of his language. Competence for Chomsky is like the acquired L1, first language. Okay? And according to Chomsky, performance is the actual use of language in concrete situations. I repeat. For Chomsky, 1965, competence refers to the speaker-hearer's knowledge of his language. And performance is the actual use of language in concrete situation. Only under the idealization set forth in the preceding paragraph is performance, a direct reflection of competence. Performance is a direct reflection of competence because every human being naturally performs what he knows, naturally does what he knows. For Victoria Frumkin and Robert Rodman, 1998, pointed out the difference between what you know about language is your linguistic competence. For Victoria, she said, linguistic competence from the competence term of Chomsky, and then linguistic performance. Those are the terms of Victoria Frumkin and Robert Rodman. Okay, so your knowledge about your language is your linguistic competence, and how you use this knowledge in actual speech and production and comprehension is your linguistic performance. That is according to Frumkin and Rodman, 1998. In that, it appears that speakers of all languages, spoken and signed, have the knowledge to understand or produce sentences of any length. Competence based on the view of generative grammar refers to the implicit system of rules that constitute a person's knowledge of language. Every speaker of the L1 has the sense and has the capacity to sense what is incorrect and what is correct of his L1 structure. Okay? To continue, this includes a person's ability to create and understand sentences, including sentences they have never heard before. Knowledge of what are and what are not sentences of a particular language, and the ability to recognize ambiguous and deviant sentences. We have that in our L1. For example, a speaker of English would recognize, I want to go home, I want to go home, as an English sentence, but would not accept a sentence such as, I want going home, even though all the words in it are English words. Competence, therefore, refers to an ideal speaker or hearer that is an idealized but not a real person who would have a complete knowledge of the whole language. A distinction is made between competence and performance, which is the actual use of the language by individuals in speech and writing. Performance, based on the view of generative grammar, refers to a person's actual use of language. So naturally, it appears that all human beings naturally have competence and performance, because any ordinary person on the street usually performs, usually does what he knows, and you don't do what you don't know. So a difference is always made between a person's knowledge of language, that is competence, and how a person uses this knowledge in producing, understanding sentences, performance. For example, people may have the competence to produce an infinitely long sentence But when they actually attempt to use this knowledge to perform, there are many reasons why they restrict the number of adjectives, adverbs, clauses in any one sentence. They may run out of breath of their listeners to get bored or forget what has been said if the sentence is too long. Jack C. Richards and Richard Tudor and Richard Smith, 2013, have argued that the language learner's actual use of language on a particular occasion may not reflect the learner's competence because errors that may occur are described as examples of performance. This may be due to performance factors such as fatigue, lack of attention, lack of excitement, nervousness. So it means to say, not all the time that you can use your competence in the actual performance that is according to Jack C. Richards. When it happens, when it possibly happens, when you are experiencing having fatigues, pagod ka, okay, lack of attention, lack of interest, lack of excitement, nervousness are the causes that your competence may fail in the process of your performance. Kahit alam mo na pala ang isang bagay, pag ikaw ay pagod, problemado, pagod ka, you are too nervous about it, things may happen that your competence may not be manifested properly in your performance. That is why we have to have a vast patience in dealing with all our students. Because if one student, very clearly, if one student cannot satisfy you with his or her answer, maybe that student is experiencing fatigue, felt nervous, okay? So his competence may not be successful in the process of his or her performance. So you have to consider those factors: nervousness, lack of excitement, lack of attention, fatigue. Or even the student is not feeling well, so you cannot expect him to have excellent performance even if he has that competence. Okay? That's a psychological factor. Okay, in relation to the cognitive model, Chomsky's theory of universal grammar, UG, universal grammar, first proposed the 1980s, is a well-developed example of cognitive model, okay, of language. According to UG theory, UG means universal grammar theory, our minds contain a mental grammar that consists of universal principles that are common to all languages. So what are common to all languages is a universal grammar. What are common? What are common to all languages is a universal grammar. So my basic question is, what are these things common to all languages? Well, that is very technically very easy to answer. Okay? What are these things common to all languages? You have to take note of this. That all languages have nouns. That all languages have verbs. That all languages have adjectives. That is what we mean by the universality of grammars. And that is what we mean by the universal grammar. You are there to look into what are common, what are these things common to all languages, that all languages have nouns, that all languages have pronouns, nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs. Those are things common to all languages, and that is what we mean by the universal grammar, or UG, and that is what we mean by the universality of all grammars in the world. Okay? Alright. The grammar translation method can perhaps be understood as an early example of a cognitive view of language teaching. Okay? Since it reflects the idea that the learner has built up knowledge of the principles of language by abstracting its rules, the study of grammar, and through translation-based activities. That is why we cannot also underestimate the traditional approaches and the audiolingual approaches. The audiolingual approaches, okay, first started in the US. Audiolingual is your traditional approaches, and that is what has been all language teachers have been doing in their actual teaching in our country. So you cannot underestimate also the traditional approach, because the traditional approach or the audiolingual approach derived from the view of cognitivism. Cognitive, that mind is like a computer capable of storing a lot of information. Okay. Now, the next model, the structural model of language teaching. Okay, the structural model, for all you know, which is another way of conceptualizing and one that has had a wide application in language teaching, is the structural view of language teaching. The view that language is a system of structurally related elements for the coding of meaning. The target of language learning is seen to be the mastery of elements in the structural view, which are generally defined in terms of phonological units, phonemes. We teach pronunciation to our students how to produce sounds correctly. Sometimes you wonder why S becomes Z sound. Okay, S becomes Z if it is paired with a sound. Words like that is sound, voiced sound, That is why if is paired with S, it becomes Z, like cars, flowers, bars. And then T is voiceless. Since that is voiceless, if it is paired with the S remains as S, like what? Cat. Cats. You do not say cats, but you say cats. D is the voiced sound, like dad, dad. That is why when you put S as possessive, you say dad's pen, dad's watch, dad's bag. Z. That is how you study the sound system. Okay. The grammatical units. Example, the clauses, phrases, sentences. So you study, you teach grammar and the structural model. And we teach that the plus noun, the determiner, noun, the plus noun equals noun phrase. Noun phrase or preposition plus NP, noun phrase, equals prepositional phrase. For example, on the farm, on the city. Now, on the farm, in the city. Okay? And then we teach the students that the prepositional phrase can be either adjectival phrase or adverbial phrase depending on how you use it in the sentence. If the prepositional phrase referring to the noun, then it is adjectival phrase. But if the prepositional phrase modifying the verb, then it is adverbial phrase. For example, you would say, some young boys in the city work hard. So in the city, referring to young boys, that is noun plural. Then that is adjectival clause. The young boys in the city work hard. In the city, modifying boys as a noun, then that is adjectival phrase. Adjectival phrase in the city. But when you say young boys are working in, most young boys are working in the city, where are they working? In the city. So that is adverbial phrase. So it depends upon how you use it in the sentence. The prepositional phrase can be either adjectival phrase or adverbial phrase depending on how you use that in the sentence. You would say, men in the city are busier than men on the farm. So men in the city, describing men, which is a noun, then that is adjectival phrase. Then those on the farm, modifying again those people, noun, then that is adjectival phrase. But when you say, most young men are working in the city, obviously that is adverbial phrase. Because that can be answered by where are they working. Am I right? So, those are the grammatical units studied in the structural model. The grammatical operations like adding, shifting, joining, transformation, etc. Or for example, in changing sentences from statement to question. When you say, men are working, and then you change that in the question, are men working? So that is what we call the shifting, okay, or the transmutation. You change the place of the auxiliary over the noun. Men are working, and then are men working? So there is what? The transmutation. You transpose, diba? Where the auxiliary gets fronted. But when you say men work hard, how do you say that? When you change that statement, that sentence from statement to question. So there is no verb noun. Since there is no noun verb inversion, you say, do men work? That is what we call adding, because there is no noun verb inversion. So you add do support. Okay? You cannot say work men hard, but you say do men work hard. Okay. So that is we do in the structural model. We study the grammaticality. We study the nature, the position, the rules of all the language rules to achieve grammaticality. That is in the structural grammar. Okay, items like function words, structure words. The audiolingual method embodies this particular view of language. Such methods are situational language teaching and the total physical response, TPR. Okay? And the TPR. Okay. And then the next is the functional grammar. The functional model of language teaching. Okay? So a different model of language and one which takes a number of different forms is the functional view, the view that language is a vehicle for the expression of functional meanings and performing real-world activities. Functional models of language are linked to the concept of communicative competence, knowing how language is used to achieve different kinds of communicative purposes as defined by Douglas Brown 1984. As that aspect of our competence which enables us to convey and interpret messages and to negotiate meanings interpersonally within specific contexts. The knowledge that enables a person to communicate functionally and interactionally and meaningfully. The communicative movement in language teaching subscribes to this view of language, as does the competency-based language teaching. Functional approaches emphasize the semantic meaning, the semantic attribution or the meaning, and communicative dimension rather than merely the grammatical characteristics of language, and lead to a specification and organization of language teaching content by categories of meaning and function rather than by elements of structure and grammar. So in other words, in the functional view, it is believed that a language should not just studied by its structure, but a language is analyzed, studied to achieve meaningful, effective communication. The English for Specific Purposes, ESP, movement likewise begins not from a structural theory of language, but from a functional account of learner needs. So you have heard over English for Specific Purposes, ESP. Technically, what do we mean by ESP or English for Specific Purposes? English for Specific Purposes, ESP, believes that all people and every person has different needs, that every person has different specific needs, that all people have different specific needs. That is why we have English for nurses, English for engineers, English for lawyers, English for technician, English for medicines, English for technology, English for business, English for language and arts, etc. So that is why ESP principles emerge. That we have different types of Englishes. We need different types of Englishes. Okay? The language structures in law are different from the language structures of engineers, of nurses, of teachers, of science teachers, of mathematics teachers, of language teachers. They have all specific needs in English. Okay? The next model would be Interactional Model of language teaching. Yet another perspective on language can be called the interactional view of language teaching. It sees language as a vehicle for the realization of interpersonal and intrapersonal relations and for the performance of social transactions between and among individuals. Language here in the interactional model of teaching, language is seen as a tool for the creation and maintenance of social relations. That is why you observe that when you go to a new place and when you can speak their language, you are very much welcome. Diba? When you meet a stranger and then you know his or her first language, when you can speak the first language of that stranger, automatically you become close with each other. Diba? Language can bind you closer socially and build a good friendship. If that is, you can speak the language of that person. So areas of inquiry being drawn on in the development of interactional approaches to language teaching include second language acquisition, interactional analysis, conversation analysis, and ethnomethodology. Interactional theories focus on the patterns of moves, acts, negotiation, and interaction found in conversational and other kinds of exchanges, and which are central to an understanding of discourse. Interaction has been central to theories of second language learning and pedagogy since 1980s. Reverse 1987 defined the interactive perspective in language education. Students achieve facility in using language when their attention is focused on conveying and receiving authentic messages. That is in the view of interactional model of language teaching. And in short, you have to provide fluency, meaningful activities to the students to perform. That is in the interactional model of language teaching. You should always provide students meaningful activities. For example, how every student does official business, for example, in depositing money in the bank, okay, in making inquiry about the plane ticket because he or she is planning to go vacation in some other countries. So such situation can be created in the classroom. Alright? That is messages that contain information of interest to both speaker and listener in a situation of importance to both. The negotiation of meaning is believed to play a central role in interactive views of language and is central to current teaching proposals, including task-based language teaching. And then the next model would be the Sociocultural Model of language teaching. A related view of language is referred to as a sociocultural model. Sociocultural theory views language as a communicative activity in which the social context is central, important. Knowledge is constructed through social interaction with others and reflects the learner's culture, customs, and beliefs, as well as the collaborative activities people are engaged in. A sociocultural view of language is sometimes said to undergird accounts of task-based language teaching, content-based instruction, and cooperative language learning. This is a very good approach when you are teaching literature. Okay? The sociocultural model. Literature, when you are teaching Philippine literature, when you are teaching other genres, like American literature, African literature, alright, world literature, because literature is highly cultural, highly multicultural approach in teaching. Okay, so the sociocultural model. Why? And there, you consider the culture, the customs, the beliefs. It is about the human activities reflection when you are teaching literature. So you can use the sociocultural model. Alright? And then we have the genre model of language teaching. Another functional model of language is the genre-based approach. Okay? The genre-based approach. Genre refers to an area of human activity where there are norms of language usage. Okay? Like in Tagalog, we have po or opo, which are not found in other Visayan languages or Filipino languages. Alright? Such as in science, business, medicine, literature. They have their own terms. They have their own genres of terms. Alright? Okay? Texts are the units of discourse that occur in different genres, such as narratives, descriptions, and explanations. This model owes much to the work of the Australian School of Applied Linguistics, drawing on the work of Halliday and others. The main concepts in this model, the genre model of language, can be summarized as follows, according to Fees 1998. First concept of genre model, that language is a resource for making meaning. That is correct. Language is a resource for making meaning. Meanings are created in the context of language. Yun ang ibig sabihin nun. Okay? You created deeper meaning when you are composing, for example, a poem, when you are writing a novel, when you are writing narratives, short stories, or even writing your own human experiences to come up with a novel. Okay? The resource of language consists of a set of interrelative systems. Third concept of genre model, language users draw on this resource each time they use language. Once you open your mouth and speak, you create meaning. And what you are using is language. Language exists among human minds. Language users create text to create meaning. Texts are shaped by the social context in which they are used. The social context is shaped by the people using language. Okay? So the genre and text approach is seen in text-based instruction as well as content-based instruction, CBI. It has also had an impact on the teaching of both English for specific purposes, ESP, and English for academic purposes, EAP. That's according to Paltridge, 2006. Okay? And the next model would be the lexical model. Lexical comes from lexicons. Lexicons, 8 parts of speech. All words that you use are lexicons. So we have lexical model of language teaching. The lexical view of language prioritizes the role of lexes, words, and lexical chunks, phrases in language, and highlights the interrelatedness of grammar and vocabulary. They are viewed as being intrinsically related, drawing on the findings of corpus studies. Advocates of lexical models of language suggest that grammatical competence arises out of phrase and lexically based learning, and argue for a better role for vocabulary as well as the lexical approach, but is also compatible with aspects of content-based instruction, CBI. Okay. The accounts above provide a very brief description of some of the different models of language that are reflected in language teaching methods. However, in themselves, they are incomplete and need to be complemented by theories of language learning. It is to this dimension that we will turn next. See you next video of lessons. Bye, goodbye, au revoir. See you around next meeting. See you next video. Thank you so much, and God bless. Yours truly, Professor Jose M. Dachugan. God bless, and I love you all.